Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the webinar When the Cash Flow Stops Flowing, Working Out Private Equity Deals. This event is brought to you by the Detroit chapter of the Turnaround Management Association. I'd like to start by acknowledging our valued sponsors. I won't read through all those, but please take a moment to take a look at those. Thank you, Amanda. In terms of establishing, Amanda. Yep, we've got upcoming events. So tomorrow, we've got a Zoom event, Zoom networking with Chicago and a few other chapters. Our annual award ceremony, May 3rd, and an automotive update on May 17th. Please take a look at all those events and please consider those for participation. So thank you. In terms of establishing some background for the panel, there's been a fair amount of M&A activity over the past few years, much of that private equity driven. Due to strong demand for companies, buyers have paid high prices and banks have been willing lenders with aggressive structures. Not all deals work, and with a softening economy, more may struggle. With private equity owned companies, it's common for the bank to not be fully collateralized and not have personal guarantees. Therefore, working out PE deals introduces complexity. It introduces additional complexity, which is what we'll discuss today. So let me start by introducing the panelists. Steve Gross is a member in and former chair of McDonald Hopkins Strategic Advisory and Business Restructuring Department, chair of the Automotive Practice Group, and was original managing partner for the firm's Detroit office for 40 years. For 40 years, he's been extensively involved in helping clients address complex business issues, including creative strategic solutions to liquidity, pricing, and other issues requiring contract renegotiation, restructuring, acquisitions, or divestitures, with deep experience in the automotive industry, as well as other manufacturing businesses and large regional franchisees. While Steve's business-based approach commonly enables his clients to achieve their goals without a court process, he has extensive experience in Chapter 11 and other formal court restructuring processes when they provide the optimal means to a desired resolution. Clients range in size from small businesses to large, middle market, multinational auto suppliers, which often remain clients after they've successfully reorganized. Lucas Barnett started his banking career in 2004, joining Fifth Third as a credit analyst. After several years as a portfolio manager in C&I loans, he moved to special assets in 2009. His portfolio at the time consisted mainly of auto suppliers and other manufacturing companies in the Detroit area. In 2011, he began supporting the structured finance portfolio, which consisted of ABL and cash flow structured leverage loan transactions. During that time, Luke handled the largest leverage loan special asset for Fifth Third, and he transitioned to a credit officer for the leverage loan portfolio. In 2021, he joined First Financial Bank, where he is Senior Director of Special Assets and Collections. Kimberly Rodriguez is a global finance, restructuring, and supply chain executive, currently working largely with family funds on industry and customer strategies, transactions, and critical finance review. Kimberly ran her own restructuring firm before selling it through to larger global consulting platforms. On exit of her consulting business, she held interim CEO positions for at-risk tier 1 suppliers on behalf of family offices and family funds, or PE funds, excuse me. Ted Sylwestrzak is senior partner in Dickinson Wright's restructuring and insolvency practice. Ted is the practice group chair for Dickinson Wright's banking and finance practice and co-chair of the firm's vehicle electrification task force. Ted has over 35 years experience representing lenders. He specializes in complex restructuring and bankruptcy situations, workouts, asset-based lending, factoring, and cross-border lending. He's well known by his clients for his proactive approach, practical business judgment, and getting the deal closed with creative solutions. Okay, The bio's complete. Let's get started. Let's start by defining PE. PE is a broad term. I think many people might consider themselves PE, or borrowers consider themselves PE, but it's a pretty broad category. So Kimberly, what is could you define what broadly falls under the private equity kind of umbrella?
Well, to your point, Jen, when people say the term private equity, and they pretty much mean literally any group that buys multiple holdings, and with the cash that has been out in the marketplace, they come in almost an infinite number of sizes, shapes, and colors in terms of private equity. We have our the basic large global private equity funds that we think of, but we also have family funds, which might hold numerous holdings. And what's really interesting about that group, where I spend most of my time right now, is that oftentimes you won't be able to see what they hold. They tend to float, in many cases, under the water level, and are extremely private, and you may or may not know really at the outset, if you're a third party, if they're actually held by a family fund. We have sponsors are very active that actually do some of the front work and the support work for family funds, and other smaller type funds. And so we see a lot of sponsor work out in the marketplace right now. And then we see a lot of different flavors in terms of industry focus. You really have, 6 or 7 different strategies, depending on who the fund is. You have a hold strategy in terms of how long, where they get the original capital, and therefore how long they can afford to hold on really to a single investment before they have to provide a return, either through a recap or a sale to their investors. You have a leverage component. Different funds function differently with leverage. Some use more or less, and that difference can be pretty substantial. You have financial and management support. So different groups may provide financial and operational support. They may tend to bring in their own management teams. They may assume the management teams are there to stay. And again, that varies pretty significantly. Then you also have platform. You have funds that focus on a single specific platform. Maybe it's an automotive platform, an industrial, a franchise. They may focus on something that's very particular. And the other thing that we're seeing right now that sometimes functions similarly and can be used in connection with an equity fund is an ESOP. So we're seeing a lot of that activity right now because largely because of the tax advantages, A, and B, because in the marketplace today, with a value softening, one of the reasons you perhaps wouldn't want to do an ESOP is because of its market value. It can only pay a base market value. It's not like a strategic where it can pay an extra high multiple. It's really a market-driven kind of base average kind of a vehicle. And so if you're not getting an advantage from a strategic buyer, which in many cases people aren't right now, they're moving to ESOPs, either in whole or in part. And that's the other differentiation between groups is really, will they take a minority percentage or a majority? So you have funds that hold minority, they hold majority. And in many cases, you even have loose investor groups that act as private equity, especially on the lower side or the startup side of the market. And they can hold 10%, all the way up in addition. So again, you really have to define down exactly who you're looking for when you're talking about private equity.
Awesome. Thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, I do see that. And 2 guys looking to buy a company, they call themselves private equity, for sure. Lucas, you're not on the front end originating deals, but maybe just kind of broadly speaking, or maybe as you see deals that were originated, do banks take a different approach, or is there differences in terms of structure if the borrower is a dedicated fund, if it's a family office, if it's an independent sponsor, maybe not having the financial backing of a dedicated fund, or two guys that want to buy a company and call themselves private equity? How does the bank look at those differently, or do they look at it differently?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, we really don't look at them differently. It's really more about understanding some specifics about, the investment that they've made, such as what is the investment thesis, understanding if there are equity tiers within the transaction, within the structure, dry powder, does the fund have availability to support the business going forward, concentration limits. So I think it's more about kind of understanding those types of things before you start to drive any type of strategy, as it relates to a workout. Now, I will say with an ESOP, it's a little bit different. The capital stack is certainly far different from what you would typically see with any really other type of structure in the market. And the last thing I would add is, what we see that has become kind of, say, fairly common is our private equity groups will also have debt within the transaction. So they're playing in both the equity as well as in the capital stack in terms of, say, mezzanine debt. So again, it's really more about understanding what you have, who you're dealing with, and then really driving a strategy from there.
Got it. Okay. This kind of next question kind of blends off of that one, and you kind of touched on a little bit, Luke, and this is for Ted and Luke. Like you're both to kind of share some thoughts on, from a workout perspective, does the nature of ownership make a difference? If you've got a acquisition financing and it's owned by a family office, or if it's owned by an independent sponsor, or if it's owned by a dedicated fund, does it make a difference to you all? Ted or Luke?
Yeah, I would say that it does make a difference because, generally speaking, the investment thesis is different and the timeline to monetize the transaction is different. So give an example, a family office can be much more patient with their capital investment versus a private equity group, generally speaking. Private equity group is going to have pressure over a certain timeline to turn these assets, to monetize them, where in my experience, a family office can be more patient. They don't have LPs to answer to, for example. And so, it can make a difference from that perspective.
Ted, some of the banks that you work with in the documentation, do you see differences in, how banks react to that? If, same set of facts, underperforming business, if it's family office owned, if it's dedicated fund owned?
Yeah, yes. I think particularly, you're looking at the, traditional small business, family owned business, they are generally much more willing to provide additional equity or subordinated debt, often for sentimental pride or emotional reasons. And, the banks recognize that, and they'll oftentimes ask for additional personal guarantees or personal collateral, where obviously that strategy is not going to be very effective usually in the private equity workout situation. And there, obviously, the private equity is much more likely to reach a decision to walk away from its investment than the smaller family-owned business. So, yeah, I think it changes the context and the dynamic from, something that, has more of a family feel, emotional component to it, to something that's just more cut and dried numbers and dollars and cents.
For sure. Steve, how about you? So you've represented funds, you represent family offices, ESOPs. Does it make a difference in terms of how they're responding?
No, it makes a huge difference for all the factors that Kimberly and Lucas and Ted were talking about. I tend to be goal oriented, and who and what the fund is about, or the family office, makes a big difference. What are they trying to accomplish? Do they want to hold it? Do they care if they walk away? Sometimes the only impediment to that is a reputational risk. Or if they're in a segment like automotive, once you get known as walking away from suppliers, you're kind of done in the space. The other thing that really matters is you got to figure out who's in charge. Because even in, having represented, portfolio companies of larger funds, initially you're dealing with the CEO or whoever it is in the company, and then sometimes out of nowhere swoops the guys from New York or wherever and totally disrupt everything, and they have a different agenda. Or, I was in a situation, company had acquired an automotive supplier, a large one, out of a 363 sale. And, there were a number of parties that, from the company's perspective, the portfolio company, you could avoid paying. But you had a parent that had other relationships with those parties and, swooped in and said, I don't care, you're going to pay them, and I don't care what the adverse impact is on the portfolio company. So it gets complicated. And, family offices, I think it was Ted that said it, in a lot of instances are not much different than the old traditional family business. They view it as, they take some pride in it. When it comes time to dealing with the bank, they're maybe willing to put up more collateral. They'll go the extra mile. Whereas a lot of the PE firms, they'll draw a certain line in the sand, which makes total economic sense. And anything above that, we walk away, which sometimes gives you leverage in negotiations, but, because the banks know it.
For sure. Well, Kimberly, how about, would you, so how do as you represent dedicated funds or family offices, how do they view underperforming companies differently amongst the different classes of, in terms of willingness to walk away? Ted and Steve have both commented on family offices being a little bit more sort of intangibly sort of connected to companies. What are your thoughts about that?
No, that's for sure. And I think Steve really hit the nail on the head when he talked about, goal oriented, because family funds have specific goals. I think pretty much anyone in business has the goal to make money, because then you're not in business and you can't reach the rest of your goals. So that fundamentally is important. But with that, and they even have whole groups, they've got the CEO group, Tugboat, which is a large organization with CEOs solely focused on, greenfield family funds that also have a people component. And that's part that comes to play in the family funds, is what their specific focus is. It could be an environmental focus. It could be a regional community focus. Oftentimes it's a people focus where they have an equal goal of, say, profitability and educating staff, or growing their employee base even, which seems to go, contrary to the, use less people. I actually have a large enterprise that is their focus, about employing more people. And so you really have to understand those goals to deal with them in virtually any setting, and especially one where it's an at-risk setting. And certainly because of that, they will tend to risk money in a different way than the equity funds. And,
Sure.
and you also, oftentimes they'll have similar banking relationships across some of their holdings. So that also comes into play when they have a variety of different holdings, maybe some more profitable than others. But you can also, on the other hand, because you are dealing with a family, is that if you cross the family in way, one way or another, you can have some people that will have a line there, and then they go scorched earth because it is more personal. It becomes less of a business decision, but for the most part, business focused, but ultimately with other goals in mind, and it's understanding those other goals.
Interesting. Thanks. I didn't think about that, but with the family offices, personalities can come more into play here. with the funds, it's like all transactional. It's, financial. Yeah, you don't want to make the old man mad, then it just gets bad. Okay, so thanks everybody. So that kind of sort of defined PE and kind of broadly appetites. So assessing a situation. So a deal's going sideways, deal's going bad. So when a PE owned deal gets to work out, what are the initial steps from a legal rights standpoint, Ted? So you had a performing loan, it was documented 6 months or a year ago. Now it's gone sideways. You're getting a file, kind of first look. What are you looking for, or sort of what's your assessment of that kind of initially?
Sure. When we can get a file in, usually the first step is to make sure that, if the borrower is in default, and usually they are, that a default or reservation of rights letter has been issued. So oftentimes that will have been done when the credit is still on the line, but oftentimes it will not. So that's usually step one, is to just get the notice of default out there so that, everybody, sort of sets an expectation that the rules may have changed. And then our second step is we do perform what we call a perfection analysis or a file review. And that is we go through the lender's documentation to make sure that it has the rights that it anticipates having in a default situation, those that are usual and customary. And oftentimes, particularly in the PE deals, they are highly negotiated. We have several PE deals where they draft the credit agreement and give it to the lender. So you really need to go literally. No, that's
true. Here's
more than a
here.
couple. More than a couple.
Yep.
Or literally, here's the credit agreement. If you don't want to do this deal, we got 10 others behind you. So particularly in those situations, you really have to go through the loan document with a fine-tooth comb, given that either it's been drafted by the other side or it's been so heavily negotiated, based on the precedent transactions over the years. So we go through that carefully to make sure that the bank has those rights and remedies, and to make sure that it's importantly properly perfected on its collateral. We do the UCC searches, title updates if there's mortgages, and those kind of things. We also try and review carefully the facts of the situation and the circumstances, particularly to see if there are any lender liability concerns. We've had situations where the line of business has stopped funding and harmed the borrower, and other of those type things, just to see, kind of size up what are our legal rights, what are our potential legal exposure. And, we also look at ways that we can improve the situation for the lender. Oftentimes there are mortgages on real property that aren't taken on the initial documentation because it's deemed as too expensive or too time consuming, or everybody wants to get the deal done. Lots of times there's intellectual property that's not been perfected on. So we kind of go through the collateral side and make sure that everything is in order. Are there, appropriate bailee waivers, appropriate landlord waivers in place, and just making sure all those things are set up. I mean, it's so, ultimately, at the end of the day, once the file comes in, we want to make sure that if the bank ends up in either bankruptcy or litigation, that the lender has the position, the collateral, and the rights that it thinks it has. Because if it doesn't have those rights and it starts, becoming aggressive or belligerent, that can end poorly if the bank doesn't have the rights that it thought it had.
Got it. Thanks, Ted. As you're talking about it, it occurs to me, these private equity folks, whether it's a fund or family office, they're going to have first-class legal too, Steve, or, somebody like him, maybe more so than the owner or operator. So making sure everything is tied down. It's always important when a deal goes into default, I'm sure, to do a documentation review, but maybe even more so if you've got deep-pocketed borrower with kind of first-class legal talent on the case. So Luke, so a deal gets, handed to you, it's coming in from the line, maybe your initial steps, you've got an underperforming client, maybe cash flow issues. What are maybe some initial steps that you might take with a situation in terms of shoring up collateral or cash flows or trying to improve things? What would be some of your initial steps?
Well, I would kind of characterize, or put things into kind of three categories to understand. One is the ownership, the structure. Two is the company itself, and three is your loan documentation. But what it really comes down to, at least from what my perspective, what I'm looking for, is to understand my leverage points. Okay, and so to start with the ownership, right? Understanding the amount of equity in the transaction. You know, how much skin in the game do they have? Who is making the decisions? Kind of gets back to what we touched on a little bit earlier. Do they have equity cures? What are their dry powder concentration limits? Kind of things of that nature, to understand who you're dealing with and what kind of skin do they have in the game, as well as experience in a particular industry. The second is evaluating the loan documentation. You know, as Ted kind of walked through, you know, a review and making sure that your UCCs are up to date, you're titled on this, IP, anything like that. But really, what I want to understand is potential gaps in my loan documentation or points that are kind of not the norm. And I'll give you a perfect example. You know, with a payment default, they have a 10-day cure period. Right, that's going to be something that I'm going to be attacking. That's kind of taking one of the first things that I'm going to be looking at is taking what I see in the loan documentation as potential weaknesses and shoring those up. But first, you got to understand what you have, right? And then lastly is evaluating the company, understanding what the initial investment thesis is. Has the company and private equity group been executing on that thesis, or have they yet to get started? Have they kind of gone off a tangent, you know, kind of understanding that perspective. And another point is I look at a company's right to exist, meaning that if they were to go away tomorrow, would anybody miss them? Do they have leverage? Do they have a real product in the market that's going to command, at the end of the day, enterprise value? And that's another point, right? So understanding what the business is worth, getting a formal enterprise valuation performed. Certainly weighing that against a liquidation, but most of the time, you know, with a lot of the private equity transactions, you know, I would say your collateral walks, and so you certainly need to understand that. That gets to your evaluation of the management team, understanding who are the key management members. Do they have any skin in the game? You know, a lot of times when a private equity group will purchase a company, they're asking key members to also contribute equity or roll over equity from oldco to newco. So you're going to want to understand that. And then I look at the cash burn, you know, so if the company is, you know, burning cash, I certainly want to understand how are those losses being funded? You know, what is the source of cash that's shoring it up? Is it outside the company, or are they kind of deteriorating their balance sheet, you know, in order to make it work? Perfect example is stretching the trade, right? Are they pushing items to the brink? And, you know, is that going to be sustainable, or are they at, you know, kind of the 1 yard line, if you will? So there's really a lot that goes into it. But again, it's kind of those 3 categories, and really understanding all of those things gets back to understanding what my leverage points are, what kind of hand I have to play. And doing all that before you make a move, period. You got to understand what you got.
Awesome.
And who you're dealing with.
That was great, Luke. Thanks, Steve. So
Yeah, no,
client rolls in the door.
Client
Yeah,
rolls in the door, and it's interesting. I'm kind of doing exactly what Ted and Lucas are doing, but from the opposite perspective. I mean, the first thing that I'm looking for, which is the first thing Lucas mentioned, is where can I find leverage? So I'm doing the same thing, looking at the documents. Did they miss anything? And then in terms of, you know, covenants, you know, is there some stuff where I can play around? Can I get some, you know, relief there? Did the bank miss something, you know, a little bit earlier and just clean it up? And does that give me leverage by threatening a filing because I can avoid things that they just cleaned up? The other thing you have to do that's a little bit different, I think, with PE, because as somebody said, they play in the debt structure. I got to look at their stuff too. Is their debt? You know, what are its relative, you know, rights and ramifications? And I also kind of want to understand the business. Kimberly will talk more about it, but even the lawyer needs to understand this. You know, does this company have other, or does the PE fund have other portfolio companies with loans to the same bank. Because I have found over time that sometimes they have credibility, sometimes the other deals
Right.
are more important to the lender because they're bigger and they're unquestionably solid and strong, that you're going to be able to get a little bit of acquiescence on some things here because of the relationship there, because the lenders know that the client's going to be motivated to do the right thing to protect the other relationship. The other thing, the one thing they didn't mention that you have to do if you're on the company side is, real quick, you got to figure out who your client is, because you can't always, you kind of come in and on the PE side, everybody's on the same team, but ultimately if there's a bankruptcy, you're not. So sometimes you have to make sure you're either representing the portfolio company or you're representing the PE fund, or who is representing whom, which is something you need to really, in my business anyway, figure out real quick, because you don't want to do this and a month or two later you're in a chapter 11 and now you have a big issue because you did work for both.
Yeah, could be different. The economic interests of both could be different.
Exactly.
For sure. So Kimberly, so private equity companies going sideways, family office, dedicated fund. What are your sort of initial thoughts if you're called in on something? Does it vary if it's not an owner-occupied company versus private equity owned? Is your approach in terms of the things that you're looking for or how you might want to manage that situation? Does it vary?
It does, and sometimes it's a little contrary to what you might think. But for example, going in on a larger deal, and this works with, dealing with big manufacturers like OEMs as well. You kind of assume when you're dealing with someone with that kind of history, that kind of money, that they have full knowledge. And I usually find in the bigger deals, that's actually less true. And so going in to really understand what the actual deal is, who actually has the information in a PE-owned fund, and it might not be the PE guys. And so sometimes I find that, because of the way they do due diligence, because of what they're looking at when they buy an entity, which might be fairly narrow in terms of, getting a good deal on a company, it can possibly mean that there are really large stones that are, not turned over. So that's really important to understand who has the information, obviously the ownership, like Steve mentioned, but also when you're coming in as an operator, which is where I would normally come in, it's who's got the information, what information can you depend on, because that's critical. And actually in the smaller, the family funds and so forth, usually that's a little more straightforward in terms of who has the information, what the actual situation currently is. And then the other thing you have to take a look at are really individuals and who can help you, and sometimes frankly who can hurt you, because that you oftentimes in situations like that in private equity, not everybody's always on the same team. And so it is important really to understand that and understand who can take you through a restructuring and potentially who cannot, and making that decision pretty quickly is also really is always really important. And then going back to the goal conversation that we had, which is fundamentally understanding what the goals of the parent company or of the equity fund, which can be very different for segments within the fund, right? So if you're dealing with a larger company, that they may want to save a piece of that company, they may have plans for a segment, a product line. And so not only are you dealing with the company as a whole, but you're dealing with the different segments, because that, fundamentally private equity generally looks at things that way. And it's understanding that segmentation as well.
Cool. All right. Awesome. So let's get into sort of corrective action. So Ted, you were commenting about how you get handed the credit agreement by the borrower. Once the deal goes into default, I'm guessing maybe things change a little bit or so how does the documentation change? Does it change materially? Does it change a little bit? Does it change a lot? Once the borrower's in default, how does that change?
Yeah, they got the old saying goes, there's a new sheriff in town once the default occurs. But ordinarily what happens is, once the credit comes in, we do our perfection analysis, and then the business people with oftentimes with the help of consultants and lawyers negotiate what the deal is going to look like, what's going to happen going forward, and then they hand it to the lawyers to document that. And ordinarily that would be documented in what we call a forbearance agreement, where the lender agrees to forbear from enforcing its rights and remedies on account of certain identified specified defaults, to give the ownership and equity a time to implement a corrective action plan. Usually it's a restructure or turnaround, trying to fix the problem. Sometimes it's to allow for a sale process or even a liquidation process. But basically to document the deal that the parties have reached. The lender does the best it can to improve its position, tries to correct any of the deficiencies that it identified in the perfection analysis. There are a whole myriad of terms that are limited only by people's imagination, but usually
Right.
you will see interest rate increase, a forbearance fee, cutting off payments to the sub debt, cutting off or reducing management fee payments, and those kind of things. So at least from the lender's perspective, while the borrower / ownership is still optimistic about the chances of righting the ship, we want to try and best position the lender to be in a position to enforce its rights if at the end of the forbearance things have not worked out and there cannot be a consensual arrangement, basically to as much as possible tie up the borrower.
Got it. Super. One thing I didn't mention at the beginning is that if there are questions from the audience, please put them into the chat if you would. I think there's two buttons. You can put them into the chat or you could submit a question. So I'll be taking a look for those. And I'd like to address audience questions in another maybe 10 minutes or so. So Luke, in terms of getting a non-performing loan back to performance, in terms of remedies, things that you're looking to change from the original structure, could be cash equity, or could be requiring them to hire consultants. What are some of the mechanisms that you're looking to impose on a borrower to improve the bank's position?
Well, I guess it kind of starts with what we want to do as an institution, right? Do we want to retain this client, or we want them to find a new home? And so, depending on what that answer is, it's going to kind of dictate my next move. But let's just say that it is an exit credit. First and foremost, you have to understand what's broken in the business. And so sometimes that will require a consultant. You can't fix something if you don't understand why it's broken and what's contributing to those factors. And so, and you're certainly not going to be successful in any type of exit at par or not if you are not addressing the issue. And so, it kind of starts with that, finding out what's broken and drawing up a plan to fix it, whether that's with a consultant or not. And then I'll look at a couple other things, such as, is the current loan structure working? Do they have access to a line of credit? Do they not? Is the amortization too aggressive? Is it stepping up? Things like that. And then really kind of, I think Ted touched on this a little bit. I'm going to be looking to stop the cash leakage, meaning that if there's mezzanine payments that are going out, if there's management fees going out, distributions, all of that's going to come to a stop. And 9 times out of 10, I don't have to ask permission to do that. If you're in default, it's a remedy that's currently available. And so, I will certainly take a look at doing that. And then as it relates to, cash burn is something that we always look at. It's really at the center, right? Liquidity is everything. And I'm going to be looking to get 13-week cash flows, such that we are in a position that we are not reacting, but instead being proactive of if we see a problem that's coming down the road, and certainly making sure there's a source of cash to fund those losses. because it's not going to be the bank going forward. To the extent they've been using the revolver up to that point to shore up some losses, I'm going to put a stop to that. And, and make sure, again, whether it's equity, if there's payment deferrals that are necessary, but generally speaking, and this is kind of a rule of thumb that I always apply, in that, number one, we can provide time. That's the one thing that we can do as an institution, is always provide time. But in exchange for that time, is my position going to get worse? If my position is going to get worse, I'm not going to provide the time. If we are providing time, right, can I improve my position, or certainly bridge to, a better outcome within a shorter period of time? And so, to kind of kick that off, we're, making sure that the reservation overrights have gone out. We've done our homework. We understand what we have, who we're dealing with. And, it starts with putting, forbearance terms on the table and starting the discussion from there. And, knowing that you're not going to get everything you ask for, certainly, but you do need to approach the situation where, I've asked for 8 things, but I really need these 3, and I'm willing to kind of give away or negotiate some others. But that's really a negotiation strategy.
Awesome. Steve, so you're representing the borrower, and you might be asked, or your clients might be asked to maybe give some gives, right? That, Ted or Lucas have talked about. You might also have some asks of your own. So what are some of the gives that you might consider, and what are some of the asks that you might ask the lender for?
Well, yeah, good question. My gives are oftentimes largely dependent on my asks. One of the things I like about being on the other side of banks is they're by and large rational, not always, but most of the time. And if you understand what their goals are, which is to get all their money back, and if it's a restructuring situation, maybe get it back on the line, you can kind of anticipate what they need. The easiest ask, and I actually encourage that, or I always encourage it, is get a financial advisor in there, which I'm sure is music to half the people on this call, but I think you need an independent set of eyes. Even if you have a very sophisticated PE firm, they don't deal in distress. They think they're very smart. No offense to any PE people who are in the audience, but they don't do this every day. It's also good for them because it's no longer their numbers being questioned, their analysis, their conclusion, their 13-week cash flow. Or they can at least validate what you're doing. And I think it gives you credibility with the lenders. And from there out, it really depends on where you're going. If you have a big cash burn, or you want the banks to actually contribute something, which Lucas is always, from what he says, very wary of doing, I think sometimes the owner's got to step up and match it. It goes back to the simple days of small clients where you want more money, well, then give me more collateral. This isn't rocket science. So if I want relaxed terms on my covenant, so I don't trip more defaults, negotiate that, and a lot of this depends on the clients, like to our earlier discussion, because sometimes they'll come in and say, I'm not putting another dime in this damn business. And if you're going to liquidate it. And I'm pretty straight up. I'll tell the lenders, my guy's not doing anything, but I think it's in your best interest to bridge to a sale, because here's why I think if we sell this, you guys can get out. Whereas if we liquidate it, you can't. And that assumes that by that time we have some analysis to show that. But like all this stuff, it really depends on the facts and the situation.
Got it. Awesome.
Yeah, and I would add to that our approach is that it's not a one-way street, meaning that we expect them to participate in the solution just as they expect us to participate, right? And so it's going to take both the bank and the client working together, including legal, to move forward and to have any chance at success.
Got it. Okay, awesome, everybody. Thank you. So we're cruising along. Actually, just for the audience's benefit, we're probably running maybe about 5 minutes long right now. So just, we are trying to manage time. So just be aware, it's advertised to be an hour. We're gonna try to keep it to an hour. I don't see any audience questions yet, so I'm just gonna continue to kind of roll on with a question. So Kimberly, so in terms of managing all the interested parties, so you got to work on, you have private equity. In the auto space, you got suppliers, you got customers. And it's not just auto, but just what's involved in managing that. So somebody's got to be the quarterback. Deal's gone sideways, bank's unhappy, ownership's probably unhappy, customers are maybe unhappy, suppliers are unhappy. Just what's involved in kind of managing that.
Well, that to your point, that's the thing, right? There are a lot of different stakeholders, and understanding who those stakeholders are. I'm working on a franchise company right now. So you have the global franchise owner is a huge stakeholder in this particular case, in addition to the family fund that owns the franchises, and the banks and the suppliers and the employees, if it happens to be an ESOP. So there are a number of different parties. So it is really important to go in initially and assess who the stakeholders are, for sure, and what their position is and what their options are. And so communication is really important. Facts are really important, and especially when you come in on the PE side. I think Steve is the one who mentioned that it really not any different if it's a PE fund or a family fund. In many cases, this is not their core competency. It's not what they do, restructuring. And so understanding that you have an education and communication process, not only with your suppliers, customers, but potentially with ownership. In the case of families, you have a conversation with ownership families. It can be just as important to be talking to the control owning CEO as it is the spouse of one of the other owners. There are a lot of parties that can play in a family fund or a privately held company, and you need to understand effectively whose opinions really matter and what they're going to act on that. And then really working through the cap structure, the cash flow. In many cases, it's not a cash flow focused organization. PE funds are not necessarily focused on cash flow in particular. They're trying to build the EBITDA, right, and so forth, ultimately for an exit. And so cash flow is not necessarily what they're focused on. And so there can be, frankly, lots of different opportunities, potentially also risks, but in many cases, opportunities in cash flow, whether that's, foreign entities, whether that's inventory levels, whether that's, again, the supply base and getting the supply base to play. And so there are a lot of different moving parts on that side. So the communication is important, and delivering on promises is important, particularly when you're dealing with something that is not people's core. And so bringing the professionals in, both on the attorney side and the consultant side, is important. Many times, particularly, and even in really large family funds. I mean, I'm dealing with $1 billion family fund right now, and they have the same people giving them advice as when they were 50 million, and it is not the same. You can really get into trouble that way, and people have the best of intentions, but frankly, it becomes they don't know what they don't know. And so making sure that you have competent help on the legal side and the finance side is super important, particularly in the fund space.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to actually, guys, everybody due to time, I'm going to skip over the next questions. Let's go down to the workout. So, it's hoped that the bank, so I think generally the bank wants to work with ownership wants to work with the bank, but it can get contentious. I mean, not it doesn't always work out smoothly. So I would maybe ask both Ted and Steve, and I'll start with Ted. So what causes, or in your view, what are some of the causes of that contentiousness, or sort of what can go bad, or what causes a deal to not be cooperative with a bank? What is,
So I think, yeah, with the PE firm, it's a lot more structured, a lot more rational, oftentimes with the privately owned, small family. But primarily, in my experience, it's differing views on the strategy going forward. I mean, ownership will oftentimes want to restructure, do a turnaround, oftentimes at the same time deteriorating the bank's position, as Luke alluded to. Whereas on the other hand, a lot of times the bank's had enough, and they want to force a sale of the company. So you end up with, equity wants to, where there's life, there's hope, keep it alive, try and fix it. And the lenders had enough, and they want to see the company sold. The other time too, as other folks have alluded to, that's the cash need. There's definitely a cash need. Equity doesn't want to put it in. The bank doesn't want to put it in. That leads to contentiousness. Steve?
No, Ted, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. I mean, from my side of the table, it's pretty much the same thing. And a lot of times, my job sometimes is to really bridge the gap, even though it's contentious, is to still keep the deal getting done. And a lot of times that's getting my clients to understand why the bank said no. They're burning cash, the position's getting worse. Why would they stick around here? And if you want them to, you're going to have to contribute. Like I said earlier, it's not rocket science.
Got it. Well, let me ask a kind of related question that we kind of skipped over. To what extent, does it portend sort of, if an initial workout is contentious with a borrower, does that kind of portend that the workout process is going to be contentious? Is that more likely if it starts out a little bit rough with the borrower, between the borrower and the bank? Does that kind of carry through historically, or maybe that's kind of irrelevant?
No,
I would ask everybody that.
From my perspective, it depends.
Luke?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying, go ahead, Kim. Not necessarily, right? I mean, yes, it can start out contentious, but I think it comes down to understanding, and Ted touched on this, what are the bank's objectives and goals, and what are the client's objectives, as well as the private equity group. And, it doesn't get anywhere by being contentious, whether it's the bank's acting that way or the borrower's acting that way. And so, try very hard to get people on the same page, knowing that what we're telling them, I don't expect them to like it, but I do make an effort to try to help them understand it. Okay. And so, just because we start off that way doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it's going to go, because there will be an effort, certainly an effort on the bank's part to try to kind of calm parties down, make sure that we're making rational decisions. But if we do get to a point where, if a borrower is being irrational, not willing to help, wants to be combative, then, we've exhausted what we can do on our side. And that's pretty much the end of the story. So, but again, just because it starts off that way doesn't mean that that's how it's always going to be.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in terms sometimes, look, you have to call a problem to be able to solve it. And in many times in advance of a restructuring, you can use a Detroit bankruptcy as an example of that, where you said, people would say, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. When I traveled, particularly abroad, Detroit went into bankruptcy. I said, are you kidding me? It's the best thing that ever happened, because now that we've called a situation that actually existed for years, we can solve it. Because if you don't identify a problem, you can't solve it. And that's the case oftentimes with funds of any size, is that they haven't actually absorbed the truth that this is a serious problem. And once they do, then you can actually bring solutions to the table, and people's ears are more open. And the second thing is, sometimes actually you can move, a deal goes from your standard banking relationship into a more asset structure, or a banking group that's fundamentally their job is to deal with, struggling entities. Sometimes that conversation can go a lot quicker, depending again, who you're dealing with on the bank side. So I would say, no, it doesn't necessarily portray starting contentious. It has to end that way.
The other thing you can do is I'm involved in a situation right now. It's a European-based family fund with operations in the States. And there's a lot of issues here because of a lack of understanding of the process here. But ultimately the solution was to appoint a CRO, because this had been going on a year before they retained me. They were just tired of beating on each other. And that was the solution, is to get an independent decision maker here. And it's still been probably the most acrimonious thing I've been involved in my 40 years, but we're going to have a good outcome. So, and you wouldn't have been able to do that without actually having equity step back. Now, I know PE firms are much less likely to want to do that, but sometimes they like to do that too, because then they can wash their hands of it. It's not my problem. The CRO did it. We have an independent board. We're out. You guys take care of us.
Got it. Deb, anything or?
No, I agree with everything everyone else said, and just because it starts out contentious doesn't mean it's going to end that way. Sometimes everybody's got to kind of stake out their territory, but usually it's more of a, the rational thought process prevails at the end of the day.
Got it. So I was actually told that the chat was not enabled, so I'm not sure. I think that's maybe a reason why we're not seeing any audience questions. I don't know, Amanda, back there, if you're able to turn that on, great. If you're not, I've got a couple more questions and we'll sort of let people go. Once a restructuring is in place, what are the risks to it unwinding? What are kind of common causes for a restructuring to come unwound? And then, just maybe I'll just sort of throw that out to everybody, but I'll start with Steve. So what's a risk that, or what are some of the drivers for a restructuring that gets done, everybody's happy, but now it's kind of broken again?
I usually think once you get something restructured, the reasons they fall apart are unanticipated economic changes. Somebody wasn't conservative enough. If you're automotive, somebody loses a contract. I don't see it happening so much because the PE firm has done anything or the lenders have done anything. Usually if the debt's restructured, and we're talking mostly about balance sheet restructurings coupled with some kind of operational fix, really what unwinds it is, things change.
Yep, I agree with that. Absolutely. Once you've had a successful restructuring, it's usually something out of the blue.
Got it.
Yeah, I mean, it's performance to plan, right? When we put a restructuring in place, we have expectations, we have projections. We're going to have covenants that are reasonable to make sure the company is tracking along with that plan. And it goes sideways if they're not tracking to the plan, right? If they, I would say, materially miss, not a minor, 5% miss on something, but something has happened where it just kind of throws it into a tangent.
Awesome. Kimberly?
Yeah, no, that's why it's so important to control the factors you can control, because there is always something out there potentially that you can't control, and what you don't want to have happen, certainly as a professional, is something that was controllable, or it isn't within your scope goes down. So if you have the professionals in play, then you should be left to those things that you just can't anticipate.
Got it. Okay, well, awesome. Well, I think we're at 102 right now, so I think we've really covered the content. So I want to thank our panel's time here. I think it's great information. Thank the audience for, well, a second, do we have a question in the chat? Oh, just one comment in the chat. Great job, guys. Which is super nice. So thanks everyone for sort of logging in for the event today. Hopefully you found it valuable. Thanks to the panelists for contributing their knowledge to it. Again, as an EBL guy, it's always glasses half empty, economy's going sideways. It certainly seems like maybe there's going to be some private equity distress out there, and hopefully this will be useful information for people. So with that, I'll just say thanks to everyone. Ted, thank you. Steve, Lucas, Kimberly.
Thanks, Jen.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.